Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into something that's super relevant right now, especially with how much we all rely on the cloud. Software-defined perimeter, or SDP for short.
That's right.
You sent over a bunch of stuff for us to go through, articles, guides,
Yeah.
even a training manual from the Cloud Security Alliance. Looks like you're really trying to get a handle on this SDP thing.
It's definitely a hot topic.
So whether you're prepping for a big meeting, trying to stay ahead of the curve in cloud security, or just really curious about how it all works,
Yeah,
we're going to cut through the jargon and give you the need-to-know info.
that's the goal.
When I was going through all this material, what really struck me is that SDP, it's not just about, building stronger walls around your data. You know what I mean?
It's a whole different way of thinking about security.
Exactly. It's like a fundamental shift.
Absolutely.
So, okay, let's start with the basics. The Cloud Security Alliance, they define SDP as, well, it's a bit of a mouthful.
It is a bit technical.
A network security architecture implemented to provide security for all layers of the Open Systems Interconnection OSI model.
Right.
See? Told you.
Yeah.
But to put it simply, it's kind of like having an invisible cloak around your data.
That's a good way to think about it.
So all your cloud servers, your apps, all the important stuff, it's hidden until the system is absolutely sure the person trying to access it is who they say they are.
Like a super-powered security guard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Much easier to picture than that whole OSI model thing.
Definitely.
But okay, why is this so important now?
Well, think about how much the world of data has changed.
Right.
I mean, it's not just a physical office network anymore.
Oh, absolutely. Everything's in the cloud now.
It's the cloud, it's remote work, mobile devices, IoT, all that stuff.
The perimeter is everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
Exactly. Traditional firewalls, they're kind of struggling to keep up with all that.
Yeah, it's like trying to guard a castle that has holes everywhere. So traditional security measures, they're not cutting it anymore.
Not really.
But SDP, it's it changes the whole game, right?
It does.
Instead of trying to keep the bad guys out, it starts by assuming everything is hostile.
Yeah. It's like, prove you're allowed to be here.
I saw in one of the articles they call it a drop-all firewall.
That's right.
Which I guess means nothing gets in until it proves it belongs.
Exactly. And a big part of that is moving beyond just relying on IP addresses.
Which, from what I'm reading, is a big problem. An IP address can be faked.
Oh, absolutely. All an IP address tells you is where a connection is coming from, not who's actually behind it.
Right. So you could have someone pretending to be in your office when they're actually who knows where.
Exactly. So SDP uses things like strong authentication, which means you need more than just a password to get in.
Multi-factor authentication, all that stuff.
Exactly. And it might even look at the device itself.
Like what kind of device it is, where it usually connects from.
Right. They use things like device fingerprinting to make sure it's not an imposter pretending to be your laptop.
That's pretty clever.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's way more secure than just relying on firewalls and IP addresses, but where did this whole SDP concept come from? It seems pretty revolutionary.
Well, it might seem that way, but it's actually been around for a while. Its roots are in a U.S. defense project from way back in 2007.
Oh, wow, really? That long ago?
Yeah. They needed a way to secure their global information grid, and they wanted something that was both flexible and future-proof.
I guess when you're dealing with military secrets, you can't take any chances.
Exactly. And that's where this whole always verify mindset at the core of SDP came from.
So from protecting top secret military stuff to securing our data in the cloud, that's quite a journey.
It is.
And it was the Cloud Security Alliance that realized this approach could work for businesses too.
Yeah, they saw that traditional security methods weren't really cutting it in this new cloud environment.
Right. It's a whole different ballgame.
So they took that core concept of always verify and developed a framework around it that was specifically designed for the cloud.
Okay, so let's talk about how this actually plays out in the real world. The listener included this egregious 11 list from the CSA, which highlights the biggest cloud security threats. Some of that stuff is pretty scary.
It is.
Account hijacking, I feel like you hear about that all the time.
All the time.
So how does SDP help with that?
Well, remember how we talked about strong authentication? SDP makes sure that users are actually who they say they are before they can even see the data, let alone access it.
So it's not just checking a password, it's using multiple factors to be extra sure.
Exactly. It might look at your location, the device you're using, even your typical behavior patterns.
To make sure it's really you.
Right. And if anything seems even a little bit off, bam, access denied.
That's reassuring, especially with all those sneaky phishing scams going around these days.
Definitely.
What about weak control planes? I feel like I'm always reading about data breaches caused by, like, compromised cloud management consoles.
Yeah, that's another area where SDP is really strong. It uses a separate control plane, which means the brains of the operation are locked down behind their own layer of security.
Oh, okay. So it's like having a separate, super secure vault for the really important stuff.
Exactly. So even if an attacker manages to get through the outer layers of security, they still can't get to the really sensitive data.
Makes sense. And that's especially important for cloud environments where the control plane is often the target of these really sophisticated attacks.
It is.
What about insider threats? Maybe not even someone being malicious, but just an employee who's careless.
Oh, absolutely. That can be a huge problem. And that's where SDP's granular access control is really valuable.
Granular, so like really specific.
Yeah, it basically means you can control exactly who has access to what data. So you can enforce the principle of least privilege, where employees only get access to the data they need to do their jobs.
So no more accidentally stumbling across sensitive information that you shouldn't be seeing.
Exactly. It's all about compartmentalizing access and minimizing the damage if something does go wrong.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, I think I'm getting how SDP is really good for security, but can we get a bit more into the technical stuff? Like, how does all this actually work under the hood?
Sure. Imagine you're on your laptop and you're trying to access some important data stored on a server.
Okay.
So in SDP terms, your laptop is what's called the initiating host.
Okay.
The server with the data is the accepting host.
Gotcha.
And there are 3 other key players involved.
All right, lay it on me. Who are the other players in this security game?
So first, you have the SDP client, which is a piece of software on your laptop. It's basically your digital key card that lets you request access.
Okay.
Then there's a controller, which is like the brain of the operation.
Okay.
Checks your credentials, makes sure you're authorized to access what you're requesting, and enforces all the security policies we've been talking about.
Like a super strict bouncer at a club.
Exactly. Making sure you have the right ID and you're on the list.
I like that analogy.
Then finally, there's the gateway.
Okay.
That's the actual door to the data.
So it sits in front of the accepting host, the server.
Exactly. And it only opens after the controller gives the okay.
So it's a multi-step verification process. You request access, the controller checks your credentials, verifies you're authorized, and then, and only then, does the gateway open the door.
Exactly. You got it.
Pretty impressive.
And once all those pieces are in place, SDP can do its magic and make your data secure without adding a bunch of extra steps for users.
Speaking of extra steps, the listener included a study guide that talked about different deployment models for SDP.
Right.
It kind of made it sound like putting SDP into practice can be a little complicated.
It can be.
There are a few different models, and choosing the right one depends on your specific needs.
Right.
Like there's the client to gateway model. That one's good if you're moving applications to the cloud or if you're dealing with older systems that can't have the SDP client installed directly.
That's right.
What about if you're already like all in on cloud services? You know, like if you're basically running your own virtual data center in the cloud.
Right, right. In that case, then the client to server model might be a better fit.
Okay.
In that model, the SDP gateway is actually built right into the server itself.
Oh, interesting.
So when your laptop, the client, tries to connect, it's talking directly to that super secure server.
That sounds pretty straightforward. The listener also mentioned being really into the Internet of Things.
Right.
Their study materials really emphasize the importance of securing device-to-device communication.
Yeah.
Is there an SDP model for that?
You bet. When it comes to IoT, the server-to-server model is the way to go.
Okay.
Think about all those smart devices, like in your home or sensors in a factory, constantly talking to each other. This model makes sure those conversations stay private and secure, even if the devices are on different networks.
So no more eavesdropping on our smart fridges and thermostats.
Exactly. It adds a whole new layer of security to the IoT world.
That's good to know. So it sounds like choosing the right deployment model really depends on what you're trying to protect and how your users need to access the data.
Absolutely. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
This has been really eye-opening.
Okay.
SDP feels like such a different approach compared to how we used to think about security.
It is.
It's not about building stronger walls. It's like creating these invisible, intelligent perimeters around what really matters.
I like that. It's a whole new mindset.
Speaking of different mindsets, I'm curious how SDP stacks up against some other security approaches out there.
Yeah.
In the materials you sent, there's a lot of talk about network access control or NAC.
Right.
How does SDP compare to that?
That's a great question. Both SDP and NAC are all about controlling who gets onto the network, but they go about it in different ways.
Okay.
NAC is very focused on the device itself.
Okay.
Like, is it running the latest security updates? Does it have the right antivirus software? That kind of thing.
So it's like checking if everyone is dressed appropriately for the party before they can even walk in the door.
Exactly. But in this cloud world, the party's happening everywhere. People are connecting from laptops, phones, tablets, you name it.
Right.
Those old rules about what to wear don't always apply.
That's a good point.
SDP takes a different approach. It's more like, hey, I don't care what you're wearing as long as you have the right credentials and you're only trying to go to the rooms you're allowed in.
So it's less about the device itself and more about the intent of the connection.
Precisely. Who are you? What are you trying to do?
Hmm.
And are you authorized to do it? That's what SDP cares about.
Makes sense. And it seems a lot more flexible than some of those older NEC systems I used to deal with.
It is.
Speaking of flexibility, I know a lot of companies use VPNs, virtual private networks, for secure remote access.
Right.
Does SDP replace that, or do they work together?
Well, in some cases, they can actually complement each other.
Okay.
But in a lot of situations, SDP can be a much more effective and modern solution than a traditional VPN.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Why would you choose SDP over a VPN?
Well, think about it this way. A VPN is like a tunnel that connects you directly to the network.
Right.
And once you're in that tunnel, you often have access to a pretty wide range of resources, even if you only need a few.
So it's like getting an all-access pass to a theme park when you only want to ride one roller coaster.
Exactly.
Okay.
SDP is much more targeted. It grants access based on your role, the device you're using, even the time of day.
So it's like having a VIP pass that only lets you into certain areas of the park.
That's a great way to put it.
That sounds a lot more secure and probably less overwhelming for the user, too.
Definitely. It gives you much more control over who can access what, which is super important in a world where data breaches are happening all the time.
And wouldn't that granular control work well with something like identity and access management or IAM? I remember that being mentioned in the study materials.
You're absolutely right. IAM is all about managing user identities and permissions. And SDP integrates really well with those systems.
Oh, cool.
Think of them as a dynamic duo of security.
Okay.
IAM says, this is who you are, and these are your permissions. And SDP makes sure those permissions are actually enforced every step of the way.
So IAM is like the security guard checking your ID at the door, and SDP is the system that makes sure you can only open the doors you're supposed to.
Perfect analogy.
I try. So they work together to create a really secure and efficient system.
Did you?
Okay, we've talked about NAC, VPNs, and IAM. What about those next generation firewalls, NGFWs?
Right.
They get a lot of hype. Are they friends or foes to SDP?
Well, NGFWs are definitely powerful tools.
Yeah.
They're great at filtering traffic and blocking known threats, but they can struggle with the complexity of cloud environments, especially when it comes to controlling access for all these different users and devices.
So it's like they're trying to guard a castle with 1,000 doors, and it's hard to keep track of who's going in and out of which one.
Exactly.
And that's where SDP comes in.
That's right. It can work alongside an NGFW, taking care of that granular access control, while the NGFW focuses on what it does best, like inspecting traffic and preventing known attacks.
So it's not about replacing your NGFW, but about adding another layer of defense.
Yeah, exactly. It's all about having a layered security approach and using the best tool for each job.
It seems like SDP is a really versatile tool.
It is.
It can replace or complement existing solutions, and it really embodies that never trust, always verify principle we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. It's not about blindly trusting anything or anyone. It's about verifying every connection, every request, every access attempt.
It's like having a personal bodyguard for your data, constantly watching and ready to step in if anything looks suspicious.
I like that.
It really highlights the proactive nature of SDP. It's not just about reacting to threats, it's about preventing them in the first place.
Right.
This has been a really fascinating look at SDP.
It has.
We've gone from the basics to comparing it to other security approaches, and it's clear that SDP is really changing the game for security in this cloud, mobile, and IoT world.
I agree. It's not just about keeping up with the changes. It's about getting ahead of them and building a really secure foundation for the future.
Now, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on something that was in the listeners' study materials.
Okay?
They mentioned the importance of device validation in SDP.
Right.
Can you explain what that is and why it's so important?
Sure. Device validation is all about making sure that the devices connecting to your network are actually trustworthy.
Okay.
We talked about strong authentication for users, but devices need to be verified too.
So it's like, just like users need to prove they are who they say they are, devices need to do the same.
Exactly. And that's where things like digital certificates come in.
Right.
Every device can have its own digital passport that proves its identity.
Interesting.
But just like a passport can be forged, a digital certificate can be stolen or compromised.
Oh, right.
That's where device validation comes in. It goes beyond just checking for a valid certificate.
So what else does it look at?
Well, it might look at the device's security posture. Like, is it running the latest updates? Does it have any known vulnerabilities? It might even check if the device meets certain compliance requirements, depending on the industry.
So it's like having a security guard at the border who not only checks your passport, but also scans your luggage and asks you a few questions to make sure you're not smuggling anything dangerous.
That's a great analogy. It's about adding those extra layers of scrutiny to really make sure only trusted devices are allowed in.
This makes a lot of sense, especially with so many people working from home and using their own devices for work these days.
Exactly. And with the Internet of Things growing so fast, you have all these devices connecting to the network that might not have the same level of security as a traditional laptop or phone.
Right.
So device validation is really important for making sure those devices aren't a weak link in your security chain.
So device validation, it's like the final piece of the puzzle.
It is.
Making sure that not only the users, but also the devices they're using are trustworthy.
Exactly. And that's really what's so great about SDP.
Yeah.
It addresses security from all these different angles and creates a comprehensive, adaptable system that can keep up with how fast the threat landscape is changing.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into SDP.
It has been.
We've gone from the basics to the really specific stuff, and I think it's pretty clear that SDP is a total game changer for security in this cloud, mobile, and IoT era.
I completely agree.
So as our listener keeps learning about SDP, I think the main takeaway is that it's not just about technology. It's about a mindset.
It is.
Embracing that never trust, always verify idea, and building a security system that's as flexible and adaptable as the world we live in.
And never underestimate the importance of understanding your own specific needs and challenges. SDP is not one size fits all, so it's about finding the right tools and strategies to protect what matters most to your organization.
That's a great point. Yeah, that's a really important point. You don't want to make things so secure that no one can actually get any work done.
Exactly. You got to find that balance. Strong security, but without making things too hard for your users. That's actually one of the things I like about SDP.
Oh, yeah.
It's designed to be pretty user-friendly, even though it's doing all this complicated stuff in the background.
Speaking of complicated stuff, one thing that jumped out at me in all these materials is how much SDP relies on encryption.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Encryption is like a core part of SDP.
Okay.
Remember how we were talking about those separate control and data planes?
Yeah.
All the communication between those planes and between the client and the gateway, it's all encrypted.
So it's like those secret messages we used to write as kids, where only someone with a decoder ring could read them.
Exactly. That's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
So even if someone manages to intercept the data, it's just gibberish without the right key.
So even if you're on like a public Wi-Fi network or something,
Right.
your data is still protected.
Yep. Which is super important because, the internet is inherently less secure than a private network.
Right, right.
So SDP is basically wrapping your data in all these layers of security. It's hidden, it's verifying who's trying to access it, and then it's encrypted just in case.
This whole conversation has really changed how I think about security. I used to think it was all about like building bigger walls and stronger locks, but SDP is totally different.
It is.
It's more like creating this invisible force field that only lets the right people through.
And it's not a static force field either. It's constantly changing, adapting to things like user behavior, device status, and the overall threat landscape.
So it's like having a security system that's always learning and evolving, making sure it's one step ahead of the bad guys.
That's the idea. That's what makes SDP so powerful. It's not just a technology, it's a whole philosophy.
I like that.
A way of thinking about security that's built for how we work and live today.
Well, I think we've given our listener plenty to think about today.
I think so too.
We started with the SDP basics, explored how it works in real-world scenarios, and compared it to other security solutions. Hopefully, this deep dive has given you the knowledge to navigate the crazy world of cloud security.
I hope so. And remember, this isn't the end of the road. Cybersecurity is always changing, so you got to stay curious, keep learning, and be ready to adjust your strategies as you go.
To our listener, if you're feeling inspired to learn more about SDP, don't stop now. Keep digging into those materials you sent over, reach out to some experts in the field, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
And as you keep learning, keep this in mind. In the world of cybersecurity, knowledge is your most powerful weapon.
That's a great point to end on.
The more you understand about the threats out there and the tools you have to fight them, the better you'll be at protecting what's important.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of SDP. We'll catch you next time for another exciting exploration of all things tech and innovation.